Do you know what happens when you put three experts of one subject all in the same room to talk about in a roundtable discussion? Well, we have that today. You're going to find out as we have three of the foremost experts on Buffalo Bills, Greg Tranter, Ken Crippen, and Jeffrey Miller talking about the Buffalo Bills and the AFC. It's call coming up for you in just a moment.
This is the Pigskin Daily History Dispatch, a podcast that covers the anniversaries of American football events throughout history on a day-to-day basis. Your host, Darren Hayes, is podcasting from America's North Shore to bring you the memories of the gridiron one day at a time. So as we come out of the tunnel of the Sports History Network, let's take the field and go no huddle through the portal of positive gridiron history with PigskinDispatch.com.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hello, my football friends. This is Darren Hayes of PigskinDispatch.com. Welcome once again to the Pig Pen, your portal to positive football history. And we are deep into our study of the All-American Football Conference. We're going team by team through that league that took place in the late 1940s and just had 4 years, but just had some very impactful years on professional football. And tonight we're going to be looking at the Buffalo franchise, and we have probably the three most experts on Buffalo professional football. We have Ken Crippen, Jeff Miller, and Greg Tranter. They are all veterans here of the Pig Pen. They've been on the program before, so they need little introduction. But having these three on here with their expertise on Buffalo professional football, it's almost like having Van Gogh, Michelangelo, and Leonardo da Vinci here talking about art. Is the way I look at it. And I'm going to get the education. You, the listeners, are going to get the education. We're going to know a lot about Buffalo and the AAFC. So, gentlemen, Ken, Jeff, and Greg, welcome back to the Pig Pen.
Thanks for having us.
Good to be here.
Well, why don't we go through alphabetical order? Ken, if you want to say maybe anything you got going on real quick before we get into our discussion on Buffalo, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, I'm currently in the process of putting together the Football Learning Academy. It's an online school teaching pro football history. Lots of classes and videos going to be launched there, as well as having a blog. So putting that together right now.
Okay. Very excellent indeed. People can look at you, find you on social media, find you on your website. We'll give you the call letters here at the end of the program. We'll also put them in the show notes. Jeff, how about you? What do you have going on lately?
Well, right now I'm basking in the afterglow of having two books published last year. 100 Things Bills Fans Should Know and Do Before They Die, which was a updated version of a book that I had written back in 2012. And then also a book called Relics, The History of the Buffalo Bills and Objects and Memorabilia, which I co-wrote with my good friend, Greg Tranter, and who's with us here. So we're still on tour as far as I know until, we're told otherwise. So if anybody wants us to speak, we speak, or we go for book signings. The other thing that we're working on right now is putting together the Western New York Professional Football Researchers Association chapter meeting, which is coming up on April 23rd. And I know we'll all be there, and anybody who's listening in is interested in going can either reach out to Darren. Maybe he can pass their name along to me, or they can reach out to me if they know how to get a hold of me. But, we are open and would welcome to anyone to come and join our group.
Well, very excellent. And a great segue into Greg Tranter. Greg, how about you? What's going on with you lately?
Of course, Jeff and I, of course, did the Relics book and something that's quite unique because we tell the history of the football team through the eyes of objects, which is actually a first for a professional sports team in the United States. I'm also newly minted the Assistant Executive Director of the Pro Football Researchers Association. So my first year on the board of that great organization. And I also chair the biography committee. So if anybody's interested in writing a biography of any professional football player, contact me and I'll be happy to help you write biographies. Jeff's written some. Ken's been involved with it as well. So it's an effort that we ultimately want to write a biography on every football player that's ever played in professional football. But we have about 600 so far on the website. And then in addition to Relics, I also wrote a book called Makers, Moments, and Memorabilia. And it's a chronicle of professional sports in Buffalo history. So it includes every team, including the Buffalo Bisons and Bills of the All-American Football Conference.
mean, I'm glad you mentioned the books. I was just did a quick count of between the three of you. When I say you are Buffalo football experts, I think between the three of you wrote almost 10 different books on Buffalo professional football between the two of you. So congratulations to you on that. And definitely, I think we have the right people here at the table to talk about this great period in football history, especially in Buffalo, New York. So, Ken, I think we'll start off with you. Maybe you could give us just a brief history of the AAFC, and we don't have to go into a lot of detail on it, but sort of, maybe how Buffalo got involved with the AAFC, their origins and ownership and things of that such to get us kicked off here.
All right, I guess you pretty much have to go back to probably 1944, a couple years before the league formed. So there were four groups that were looking to get teams in the NFL. One of them was a group for Los Angeles. Bing Crosby and Don Amici were part of that group. San Francisco had a group. Anthony Morabito was heading that up. And then there were actually two teams from Buffalo. Charles Murray, who's a sports promoter in the area, he tried to get a team, as well as Sam Cordovano. He was the leader of the Globe Construction Company. So those four teams are trying to get into the NFL, and ultimately the NFL rejected all four proposals. So once they rejected that, then Arch Ward, who formed the All-America Football Conference, reached out to three of those teams. The Charles Murray contingent pretty much fell out of favor pretty quickly. So you had the Los Angeles group, the Anthony Morabito group in San Francisco, and then the Sam Cordovano group for Buffalo. All three of those teams were admitted into the All-America Football Conference, and that's really where Buffalo got started, is getting into that. So Cordovano, he was a co-owner, general manager, and interim head coach for the team. So he was wearing multiple hats. And he went around, he was signing a lot of different players. But right before the season started in 1946, he dropped out. So he was running his construction company, and it started expanding pretty rapidly and doing a lot of work outside of Buffalo. And so he decided that he was going to drop his duties, not only with the Buffalo team, but he was also an officer in the conference itself, dropped all those duties and left right before training camp. So that kind of left Buffalo in, a pretty bad situation, because they lost a co-owner. I mean, they had other owners that could kind of take up the slack there, but he was the general manager as well and was the head coach. So they were scrambling around, and they were able to sign another coach, Red Dawson. But you can tell that they had done things pretty quickly, because it was only a 35-minute interview, and they hired him. So I think they just decided to hire the first person that came along. And most of the team, fortunately, was signed. So there wasn't a lot of player signings that Red Dawson needed to do. But it wasn't his team either. So he struggled a little bit with that team that initial season, because he didn't have the players that he wanted to. And it wasn't until more like 1947 before he started putting his stamp on it and being able to push things forward with the team itself.
Very interesting. Thank you for that. Now, Jeff, you being the expert on the stadiums in Buffalo. Now, we know that's an integral part. If you're going to have any home games, you got to have a venue to play in. Maybe you could talk to us a little bit about maybe the stadium that they secured there for that first season, the AAFC.
Sure. Well, as we knew it was War Memorial Stadium in its last days here, but when it was built back in 1937 as a WPA project, it first opened as Resch Stadium, and Roesch, it was pronounced Resch, and it opened in 1937, and it had a capacity of 35,000 people. It could hold. The first pro teams to play there were the AFL teams, another American Football League team, that was active in the early 1940s. The Bills had the Buffalo had teams called the Indians and the Tigers. They played in 40 and 41. They played in the stadium that had been renamed Civic Stadium by 1938. So by the time the AAFC comes around, Civic Stadium is really the only place in town where you could have a professional football team play. There were other stadiums, but Offerman Stadium was a baseball stadium. You couldn't really use it for football. So there really wasn't too much of a choice. I know you had asked about if they had other places they could go to, or if they really had to hunt for a place, but pretty much Civic Stadium was it. And but by 1946, it was only 10 or 11 years old. It wasn't that old, so it wasn't as dilapidated as we came to know it once the Bills got there in the 60s.
Very interesting. I wasn't sure if maybe, University of Buffalo had a stadium or something. I know sometimes some of those early professional teams would play at the college stadiums, but no, that's makes perfect sense. Mm-hmm. Greg, I guess the next question is for you. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that inaugural season in 1946 and, anything memorable from that season, players or games or events you could talk about.
Yeah, so 1946, at least on the field, wasn't the best season for the Bisons. They ended up with a 3-10-1 record, which was good for third place in the Eastern Division. What was impressive, though, is the fan support. They got consistent fan support and averaged 16,851 fans per game, which today wouldn't sound like a lot, but back then the average professional football attendance was actually less than 15,000 across like the NFL and the All-American Football Conference. So in comparison to their peers, they drew, they drew pretty well. Their biggest struggle was at quarterback. They tried 4 different quarterbacks through the season. George Turlap played the most, threw about 123 passes, completed only 39% of those, and tossed 14 interceptions. So they struggled getting good quarterback play. They did have one good running back named Vic Kulbitsky. He actually was the 3rd leading rusher in the All-American Football Conference that year with a little over 600 yards. Buffalo started the year 0-6-1. Their first victory came over the San Francisco 49ers, who finished the season 9-5. So it was a reasonable upset at the time. They beat them 17-14 to secure their first win. Their only 2 other wins were against the Brooklyn Dodgers and the Chicago Rockets, both of which were teams kind of at the lower end of the standings. They did take a couple of brutal losses. They lost to the champion Browns 42-17, and their worst performance was against the Dons, the LA Dons. They lost 62-14. So, overall, their defense was their biggest problem. They allowed 370 points, a 26-point average. So they struggled, but the fans were happy to have pro football back in Buffalo, and we're looking forward to 1947 despite a 3-10-1 record.
Well, I guess that's a problem for any defense in any era. If you're giving up 26 points a game, that gives you some problems, doesn't it?
Yes.
Now, Ken, I know we know that they were the Bisons that first season. Now, there were some changes coming up as, like Greg says, they were looking forward to the 1947 season. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, in particular, their name.
Well, there was some confusion, or at least they wanted to try to differentiate themselves from the baseball and hockey teams. So they ran a contest to rename the team, and there were essentially 4 main names that came out of that. So you had the Buffalo Blue Devils, the Buffalo Nickels, and the Buffalo Bullets. So those were the lesser choices, but Buffalo Bills ended up being the winner of that particular contest. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is, the reference to Buffalo Bill Cody. Also, the owner, Jim Brule, he was the president of the Frontier Oil Company. And so Buffalo Bill Cody, Frontier Oil, same type of theme. So that's how they came up with Buffalo Bills. So James Dyson ended up winning that contest, and he got $500 for his efforts.
Wow. Now, was that the first time that any professional team was called the Bills in the area?
If my memory serves correctly, yes, it is.
I would say yes.
Oh, okay. So that's the beginning of the Bills name. That's very interesting indeed.
The original Buffalo Bills.
Yeah.
That's right.
All right. Now, Jeff, next question is for you. Let's get into that 1947 season and tell us about that.
Well, 1947 was a major upgrade from the previous year when they only won 3 games. In 47, they ended up with an 8-4-1 record and fall 2.5 games short of winning the division title, losing out to the Yankees. But I think the major upgrade for them was the acquisition of George Ratterman, the Notre Dame quarterback. As Greg alluded earlier, they had George Turlap, and then they had Al Dectebrun as their quarterbacks in the first year, who were both very ineffective. Ratterman completed over 50% of his passes, barely, but over, and he threw for 22 touchdowns and 20 interceptions. So he was a major upgrade at that position. And then you also saw the emergence of Chet Mutrin as a star back in the league, because the year before he had been kind of I don't think he was a starter, but in 47 he emerged. He gained 868 yards, and he had an incredible 6.2 yards per carry average, which is really unbelievable. George Ratterman was throwing to Al Baldwin, who was his primary target, and Baldwin was second in the league in yards per catch. He had an 18.7 yard average per catch, and so they were a much better team in 47. They also had Steve Juzwick, who was one of my personal favorite guys from Notre Dame. So I'm throwing a shout out to Steve. So
awesome.
The Yankees, they won the division by 2.5 games and lost to the Browns like everybody did in the championship game. But I think they give the Browns the closest contest of any of the championship games, because it was only a 14-3 final. And the Bills play the following year, which we'll get into later. But the Yankees really gave them a tough time. But the Browns were so dominant that it was,
Greg, if you could maybe tell us about the next season, which would be the 1948 season.
So it was actually an exciting season as the Bills and the Baltimore Colts battled for the Eastern Division title, and the Colts were led by a rookie quarterback and a future Pro Football Hall of Famer named Y.A. Tittle. And so they battled. They both ended the regular season with 7-7 records. As Jeff mentioned, the Bills were still led by Ratterman. That season, he threw for 2,577 yards and 16 touchdowns. They had a really strong rushing attack, not only with Chet Mutrin, who had 823 yards rushing, but they also had Lou Tomasetti, who had 716 yards rushing. And Mutrin ended up leading the league in scoring with 16 overall touchdowns for 96 points. So the Bills had a pretty powerful offense. They scored 360 points for the season, but they still had that struggling defense and gave up 358 points. So, which is why I think ended up 7-7. They started the year slow. They were only 2-5 at midseason, but then reeled off what I think it was 4 out of 5 wins. But the interesting part, they went into Baltimore the last game of the season, and if they beat Baltimore in Baltimore, they would have won the Eastern Division. They lost 35-13, and so they were tied. And so Buffalo had to go back to Baltimore again the following week in a divisional playoff game for the right to play the Browns in the championship game. So on December 12th, in the only playoff game, not a championship game in AFC history, the Bills played the Colts, fell behind 17-7 into the fourth quarter, and then Ratterman got hot and threw a 66-yard touchdown pass to a guy named Bill Gompers, and then he threw a 35-yard TD pass to Baldwin. They went ahead 21-17. the defense actually played well, and they scored another touchdown. Buffalo won the Eastern Division with a 28-17 win in Baltimore. For the right, I guess, to get routed by Cleveland because they had played the Browns twice during the regular season and lost 42-13 and 31-14. So not many people, except maybe the Bills themselves, thought they could beat the Browns, and of course they didn't. They had 6 turnovers in the game, in the championship game, and lost 49-7. So it wasn't much of a championship game, to say the least.
Yeah, when you hand the ball over 6 times in one game, I don't know of any team that can win those ball games. That's a tough sled.
One of the interesting things is the last touchdown in the championship game was a 39-yard interception return by Lou Saban, who would come back to coach the Bills in the American Football League and lead them to the AFL title in 64 and 65. So
okay.
Kind of an interesting trivia question.
Yeah, that definitely is a great connection there.
Can I throw in another trivia question or bit of trivia there?
Absolutely.
Piggybacking on Greg, the first quarterback to lead in Buffalo pro football history to lead his team to the playoffs is George Ratterman, not Jack Kemp. It was George Ratterman. So it's just a bit of trivia.
Okay. So there's a lot of firsts going on here in the AAFC for Buffalo.
Yeah.
Excellent. Very good. All right.
I should say too, the Browns finished 15-0 that year. So they were the first professional football team to complete a season undefeated and untied.
Yeah, so step aside, Miami Dolphins of 72. You have some company.
Right.
Sure.
That's right.
Wow. All right. Well, great stuff, guys. Now, Ken, maybe you could wrap up that final year of 1949 and let us know what happened.
Sure. Actually, piggybacking off of what Greg had just said about the undefeated season, to put things in context too, they went 29 straight games without a defeat. And when you think about the 4 years that they were in the league, they won more championships than they lost games.
Wow. Yeah, that puts some perspective on it, that's for sure.
Yeah. So that 29 game streak was, they won most of 1947, winning the championship, won all of 1948, winning a championship, and then go into 49 and again won the championship. So I don't think you'll ever see anything like that again.
No, definitely not. Wow. I didn't realize that. That's tremendous.
All right. So talking about the 49 season. So one of the things that happened was they didn't renew George Ratterman's contract going into the season. So they brought in another quarterback who also played in the All-American Football Conference. He was with Chicago, also played with San Francisco, Jesse Freitas. And, they brought in a few other players, but the biggest thing was the loss of Ratterman. First game of the season, Freitas goes 4 for 9 for 10 yards and 2 interceptions. That's his box score for that first game. They immediately released him and then re-signed Ratterman. They knew that they weren't going to go anywhere with Freitas as quarterback. So they brought Ratterman back, and in his first game back, they play the Cleveland Browns. And we were just talking about their dominance in the 48 season going into 49. The Bills actually tied the Browns 28-28, and they were actually up 28-7 at one point. And then the Browns came back. So again, as we had talked about before, defense was an issue. But the fact that both games that they played during the regular season against the Browns, they tied them. So they were showing at least something against the competition. But about partway through the season, it was actually the game against the Los Angeles Dons on, I think it was October 9th. Buffalo was up 14-7. Then within 20 plays, the Dons went up 35-28. So it didn't take much to really turn things around and to show that Buffalo was struggling. Los Angeles ended up winning the game 42-28. And then after the game, Red Dawson, quote unquote, resigned from the team. Everything that I hear is that he was forced out. that it was not a voluntary resignation. The players themselves weren't happy about it either. I mean, they didn't like Red Dawson, but they knew what they were getting with him. And they didn't think that the replacement coach, who was one of the assistants, Clem Crow, didn't think that he was an upgrade at all. Throughout the rest of the season, it was a little bit of an upgrade, at least as far as a win total. When Dawson was resigned or fired from the team, they were 1-4-1. And they finished up the season 5-5-2. It was good enough for a playoff berth because at that point they had gotten rid of the two different divisions and had one division. And what they did was they took the top 4 teams into the playoffs. So the Buffalo team was their 4th seed, and so they made the playoffs. But they went up against the buzzsaw that was the Cleveland Browns, and they ended up losing 31-21. So they made somewhat of a game of it, but still Cleveland dominated. And so Cleveland won again that season and picked up their 4th championship.
Well, it's amazing though, from what you're saying, if they played the Cleveland Browns 3 times that season and only had a minus 10 point differential against them, 2 ties and a loss by 10, that's not too bad. That's a lot better than the previous 3 years. So
yeah, which is why, they thought that, if they were going to go into a 1950 season, that they were going to be in pretty good shape. But obviously, as we're going to talk about shortly, that didn't happen.
Yeah. Well, why don't we get into that right now? What did happen after the 1949 season?
Well, throughout the history of the All-America Football Conference, the AAFC was constantly trying to work with the NFL, whether it was to have joint championship games, common drafts, things like that. But the NFL refused to even talk to them. But because of financial difficulties in both leagues, there were teams losing money. They were struggling. You had lots of players that were fighting, back and forth as far as who was going to play in what league. They decided that the only way that they were going to survive is to kind of combine themselves together. And when I say it's a merger, it really wasn't a true merger. They did bring in 3 teams from the All-America Football Conference: the Browns, the 49ers, and the Baltimore Colts, not to be confused with the current Colts because they're not the same franchise. There were some rumors that, the Dons would merge with the Rams and the New York Bulldogs would merge with the New York Giants, but none of those were actually true. So what happened was you had the 3 teams, the Browns, the 49ers, and the Colts coming into the NFL. And then they had a dispersal draft. And so that was to take the existing players in the All-America Football Conference and through a draft process, disperse them among the NFL teams. Jim Brule, the owner of the Bills, he lost a lot of money. He claimed he lost over $700,000 in the 4 years running the Buffalo team. So what he did was he ended up selling a couple of his players. Abe Gibran, Rex Baumgartner, and John Kissel, sold them to Cleveland, and he theoretically got a percentage of ownership of the Browns in return. Digging into it, I'm not sure how much. Originally, they said 25%. I don't think that was really the case, but let's just say he got partial ownership of the team. But then shortly thereafter, he kind of disappears from the landscape. So he probably sold his interest back to Cleveland at that point. So now Buffalo still wanted a team. There was interest, but the problem is they had no ownership. So there really wasn't an official team there. So the community got together and they formed the Buffalo Bills Football Club to try to prove to the NFL that there was enough support in Buffalo in order to have a team come into the NFL. So it was a civic organization. They started selling season tickets. They started selling stock in order to raise money. So they had over $250,000 in money that they raised, 15,000 season tickets. So they're able to show that there was some interest, but the NFL was hesitant. There's multiple things that they were worried about. One is there really was no official team to bring in, so they'd be starting from scratch. Also, because it was a civic organization and not a single owner, they really wanted, even though they didn't codify it in any of their constitution or anything like that, they didn't want a civic organization owning a team. They wanted one person that has the authority to make all decisions. And eventually, they did put it in their constitution because of what was happening with Green Bay for the same reason. But at that time, it wasn't codified in their constitution. There were some issues they were talking about, the climate in Buffalo. There's too much snow, it's too cold and stuff like that. So when the civic organization was going through and making their case, they looked at the weather in other cities like New York City and Green Bay, and they're saying, well, what's different about Buffalo compared to these other cities? And actually, they proved that the weather over time was better in Buffalo than it was in these other existing NFL cities. So that kind of negated that argument. So then the final thing came down to the commissioner drawing up a schedule. This is something that the owners were saying they wanted to see, is say, okay, we have now 14 teams. How are we going to work out the schedule? What are things going to look like? That's something that was pretty important to the owners. So the commissioner, Bert Bell, said, all right, I'll put together a preliminary schedule and I'll present it at the owners meeting when we're considering Buffalo's candidacy. Bert Bell never presented that schedule. And so when it gets to the meeting itself, they originally said, okay, we'll consider them. But then it got to the voting. And once it got to Dan Reeves, who is the owner of the Los Angeles Rams, he said, I don't see a schedule. As a result, I'm going to vote no. And at that point, you had to have unanimous consent in order to admit a team into the league. So just his vote alone was enough to kill Buffalo's candidacy. But in the end, it was 9-4. So there were 3 other owners that voted no. Anthony Morbido, which is an interesting one since he was the owner of the 49ers at the All-America Football Conference. He voted no for Buffalo coming in. George Halas, who originally said yes, that he was in favor of Buffalo, now voted no. And then Ray Benningsen, who was the owner of the Chicago Cardinals, he also voted no. But once Dan Reeves said no, that pretty much killed the Buffalo's chances of coming into the NFL.
Now, Ken, I have one question. Now, the NFL in 1949, did they only have 11 teams? So they added an odd number of teams that previous season because they took 3 of the AAFC teams to make an even number. Or did somebody drop out?
Taking those teams made it a 13-team league. And so they were going to make it 14 by bringing in Buffalo. So to me, it would have made sense to even it out. But instead, they decided to go with 13 and then have a rotating team kind of floating between the divisions that they had.
Okay. I was wondering now if they, okay, so you're right. That doesn't make any sense why they wouldn't have an even amount of teams. Sort of defeats Bert Bell's his vision for it, I guess, for the schedule. So,
right.
Very interesting. All right.
Well, that ended up only lasting 1 year because then the Baltimore Colts went out of business after one season, which even made the choice of not picking the Buffalo franchise even more kind of ridiculous. Because part of what Ken didn't say is Buffalo also had some of the better attendance. They were a stronger franchise than Baltimore was by a lot. And so it ended up going back to a 12-team league 1 year later because of Baltimore failing.
And that's an interesting story too, because originally George Preston Marshall of Washington didn't want Baltimore in there because of infringing on his territorial rights. But then the NFL and the All-America Football Conference sent some money his way, and he suddenly changed his mind, and Baltimore was going to be allowed in the conference, and that prevented Buffalo from coming in.
Hey, a few greenbacks is always very influential, I found. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
George Preston Marshall is a very character individual.
Yeah, he might be one of the evil people in the background of the NFL history here. There's a lot of nefarious things that have been associated with him. So let's just
absolutely
that.
Right.
That's for sure. Well, Now, Greg and Jeff, I want to turn my attention to you. You two are the collectors. You have the great book Relics on Buffalo Bills history. What kind of items maybe you have in the book, or maybe in your collections, that date back to this AAFC era? And tell us a little bit about them.
I'm going to defer to Greg. I'm not really a collector. I do have a small collection of memorabilia, but it's mostly sentimental stuff I get organically from through my family, or I've inherited. So most of my stuff is really not like collectible, or, I'm not like Greg, where, some of the stuff he's got is just unbelievable. So, I'm going to defer to Greg. I know Greg does have some interesting AAFC items. So take it away, Greg.
Sure. So to pick up on Jeff's stadium stuff, so stadium seats from Civic Stadium or Memorial Stadium, so there are stadium seats in the collection that actually go back to the original stadium from 1937, but people clearly sat in those seats to watch the Bisons and Bills of the 40s play. So that's kind of a highlight. I have a George Ratterman autographed mini helmet, which actually has the logo of the team on the side of the mini helmet. You won't find many mini helmets of the Buffalo Bills of the 40s, and with an autograph of George Ratterman on it. So,
right.
So that's kind of an interesting piece. And then I have the opening game program against the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1946 from September 8th. So that was their first regular season game. And then I have a first year pennant. They sold pennants in those days. And it's actually a photo of a kicker, or a drawing, I guess, of a kicker. So those are probably some of the more interesting and unique things. I have some ticket stubs, some other programs.
Don't you also have the skin to the bass drum from the marching band?
Oh, yes. Thank you. That's, there's interesting. There was Buffalo, the Bills had a marching band, their own. And there's a drum cover. It's actually on exhibit at the History Museum. There's a drum cover that has the logo on it, which is kind of interesting. And to think that, like the NFL today, the Bills don't have their own band, and they wouldn't even think of doing that. They have a little thing, but they typically, the pro teams use college bands if they have anything like that. So kind of interesting.
Well, now that you said that's in the museum, you just sort of destroyed my vision. I'm picturing you, when we get off the air, you're going to be sitting in one of the stadium seats with Ralph Wilson's gold jacket on, with a whammy weenie beating the drum or something.
There you go. Yeah, pretty much. That's my pregame ritual.
There you go. Oh, very excellent. Those are some great tiebacks to that era of football. Very, very neat to have those in your collection. And thank you for sharing those with us.
Yeah, sure.
Now, I guess unless anybody has anything to add, I'd like you guys to, give out your where people can find your books. Where a little bit about the FLA, where people can find that, and any other things you want to talk about before we sign off here. So go ahead, Ken.
All right. Well, I've got a couple of books related to the All-America Football Conference. The first is The Original Buffalo Bills, obviously about the topic that we're talking about tonight. Second one is one that I co-edited with Matt Reeser. It's called The All-America Football Conference. Both of them you can find on Amazon, or if you want to go to the publisher, McFarland, you'll be able to order them there. Then the Football Learning Academy. So www.football-learning-academy.com. We have classes loaded there right now that you can start taking. We have the blog that's active, so you can read our blog posts. And we're going to continually add more classes over time to the FLA. So hopefully everybody enjoys it.
Oh, I know I have so far. So yeah, please check that out. We'll have that in the show notes, that information too, and on Pigskin Dispatch website. So Jeff, go ahead.
Well, I have several books, mainly on the Buffalo Bills, but I've written about other subjects as well. But the 100 Things Bills Fans Should Know and Do Before They Die, which was republished this past year, and Relics, which I wrote with Greg. I have been approached by a publisher about putting together another Bills book, which we're looking at. If I do decide to do it, would have a publication date of not this coming football season, but the following year. But my books are available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble if you're in the Buffalo area. So they're pretty much everywhere. And I'll let Greg try to explain where Relics can be found because it's very confusing.
Okay. Once again, great segue into Greg.
Yeah, so Relics can be found on the publisher's website, which is St. Johann Press, Johann being Johann. They're in New Jersey, but the book can be found on their website. It can also be purchased at the Buffalo History Museum and pretty much all the local bookstores in Western New York. It's not on Amazon yet. We're still waiting for that to happen. Hopefully soon. And then my second book, which I briefly mentioned, is Makers, Moments, and Memorabilia, a chronicle of Buffalo professional sports. That's available from the publisher, which is Western New York Heritage, which is a Buffalo, Western New York organization. That can also be found at most of the local bookstores in Buffalo, as well as the Buffalo History Museum. And then I'll have another book coming out this fall called The Buffalo Sports Curse. That will come out, and it identifies 32 cursed events in Buffalo sports history. So more to come.
So is that like just in time for Halloween with the curse theme, or?
Yes, exactly.
Sounds very interesting. That sounds like some
and
great.
That'll be available through RIT Press, and that one will be on Amazon for sure.
Well, very excellent. So I guess my count of 10 is already obliterated of the books you guys have out on those by the end of this year. So great job by you folks. And John, I appreciate you gathering here, spending your evening talking about Buffalo Bills history and the Aafc and Buffalo Bisons. Don't let me forget that one year. And appreciate you all. And we'll see you in almost exactly a month from now, and we'll all be in the same room talking some football.
Absolutely, sounds great.
Thank you. Thanks.
Peeking up at the clock, the time's running down. We're going to go into victory formation, take a knee, and let this baby run out. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you back tomorrow for the next podcast. We invite you to check out our website, pigskindispatch.com, not only to see the daily football history, but to experience positive football with our many articles on the good people of the game, as well as our own football comic strip, Cleat Marks Comics. Pigskindispatch.com is also on social media outlets, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and don't forget the Pigskin Dispatch YouTube channel to get all of your positive football news and history. A special thanks to the talents of Mike and Gene Monroe, as well as Jason Neff for letting us use their music during our podcast.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? You should check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Pictorum Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. Instead of a boring old tie, get him a historic baseball photo taken by Henry High Sandom at the historic Polo Grounds Stadium in New York City during the 1894 Temple Cup. Or, if he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL poster. These are so good looking that you'll be amazed how they turn out. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order.